Good evening. And with one jab, we'll be free. Actually, billions of jabs in a worldwide medical mobilisation. And the jury's still out on if, let alone when, we can get on top of the coronavirus. But news this week that a second vaccine had proved effective has lit what the Health Secretary cautiously called a candle of hope. The medical problem, developing the vaccine, may have been solved. The ethical problems are only just beginning. For a start, who gets it? The answer in national terms seems to be the rich. Some 82% of the stocks of the Pfizer vaccine have reportedly already been bought up by governments representing just 14% of the planet's population. The way of the world, perhaps, but there are those who say it is epidemiologically inefficient as well as globally unjust. Second, what do we do about those who refuse the vaccines because of their religious beliefs, their conspiracy theories, or their concerns that the warp speed rush to develop them has cut corners and they're not convinced they're safe? Social media are full of their theories, and anti-vaccine scares have already had a serious impact on immunisation programmes against other diseases. Last year, the head of the NHS said parents refusing to have their children vaccinated was a public health time bomb. The exercise of their individual liberty may threaten the safety of the rest of us. So should there be a crackdown on fake news about the coronavirus? Indeed, should these vaccines be made compulsory? Salvation, freedom and justice, the morality of vaccination, and our moral maze tonight. The panel: Anne McElvoy, senior editor at The Economist; Mona Siddiqui, professor of Islamic and Interreligious Studies at Edinburgh University; the chief executive of the RSA, Matthew Taylor; and the historian Tim Stanley. Our next witness is Professor Tom Solomon, who's director of the UK's Emerging Infections Research Unit at Liverpool University. Professor Solomon, in one word, should COVID vaccination in this country, at least, be compulsory?
Hopefully not. That's two words, I'm sorry, but that's as short as I can make it.
OK, what's the moral case for, do you think?
Well, I say hopefully not, because we now have these vaccines coming online, which is wonderful. And we know that we would need about 60 to 70% of people to get vaccinated to create the herd immunity that's needed to get this pandemic under control. And the latest data from the UK suggests that about 7% of people have said they would not want the vaccine, and about 20% have some concerns, and the rest would want to take it. So you can see those numbers, if you add them up, are getting close to the point where we may not get the herd immunity that we need. And so our first job is to reassure and convince those who are uncertain that they would benefit from getting the vaccine. But if we can't convince them to do that, then that's when we have to start thinking about compulsory vaccination. And by compulsory, I'm not talking about dragging people down to the clinic and jabbing them in the arm, but there are precedents from other vaccines where vaccines are mandated and then there are penalties for those that don't get vaccinated.
I understand. Anne McElvoy?
And to pick that up directly, in that situation, Dr. Solomon, would you take the view that a compulsory element was justified? It's quite a big intervention, isn't it, into the freedom of the person to decide what doesn't go into their bodies?
It could be justified, and we only have to look at the kind of restraints we've put on people recently through this pandemic. If it's justified to lock people up in their homes and to have major lockdowns, to make it harder for people to get healthcare, unfortunately, which has an impact on their health, to put them in situations where their mental health deteriorates. If all of that is justified, then we also have to consider that it might be justified to use a vaccine which gets rid of all those other problems.
Aren't you on a rather dangerous moral ratchet there? Because you've just laid out a number of things that not everyone agrees with. Some people do and a lot of people don't, and you could even divide up between the examples you gave. And then you're saying, well, as we can do this, then we can also basically prod you very hard, compel you to have vaccination. It seems that you're kind of almost doubling down on a compulsory mentality there.
Well, I thought putting the collective above the individual is what happens in society. That's what society is, isn't it? We don't allow ourselves to drive along at 150 miles an hour. We force people to wear seatbelts. As a society, we make people do a lot of things that individually they don't want to do. The critical question here is it justified in this case?
Would it work? Let's switch to would it work? Would there be a moral case because it would work? When you have an anti-vax movement out there that is very, very reactive and thinks that the sort of state is trying to impose too much in the first place, is it not better to go by nudge rather than by compulsion?
Well, certainly, as I said at the start, we would hope that we would be able to convince people and educate them and reassure them. I mean, the rationale for pushing vaccines is not just for the collective benefit, but the individual benefits as well, even if they may not realise it and may not believe it. Because for all the vaccine preventable diseases that we have studied to date and for which we have vaccines, the benefit to the individual of being vaccinated is far greater than the risk of the disease. And we only have to think about things like measles, where pre-vaccination there were thousands of cases. It's a very serious disease. It causes this brain swelling called encephalitis, which leads to death. And that would have continued if we didn't push the vaccines.
I have no objection at all, I should say, to the case pro-vaccination. So you don't have to, I think, convince us of that. I think it's the moral, literally, as it happens to be the show, the maze of what follows from that and what you do and don't do. And if we look at a resistance to vaccination, this isn't just something that got going in slightly crazy social media echo chambers, is it? There is a long history about this. Voltaire deals with it in one of his letters when he's actually, like you, advocating for the benefits and the virtues of vaccination in the 18th century. But he does see that there is it's almost a sort of a historical argument that you have to win. And my question is whether going the way towards a compulsory system, Australia is one example, actually means that people push back even harder, and whether you worry about that.
Well, I do worry about the anti-vaxxers, and I think the hardcore anti-vaxxers, the conspiracy theorists, are people that would be very difficult to convince. But the group we want to target really are the vaccine hesitant, those who are confused. They hear that vaccines are good for you, are helpful. There's a lot of anti-vax literature out there. And those are the people that you would want to encourage as strongly as possible. When you say, would it work? The data from places where there is compulsory vaccination, for childhood vaccinations we're talking about now, like France, Italy, other European countries, Australia, shows that actually making it compulsory does increase the amount that children are vaccinated. And also the most recent data from France show that actually people find it reassuring. The hesitants feel much less hesitant because there's a very clear message from government which says, this is good for you, we're going to give it you.
Professor Solomon, before I hand you over to Tim Stanley, people might be intrigued to know what kind of penalties, and very briefly, what kind of penalty or sanction would you see in the COVID case, or indeed generally?
Yeah, that's a good question. When it comes to childhood vaccinations, typically the sanction is if you don't vaccinate your child, you're not allowed to send them to state schools. In Australia, you're also not allowed to claim benefits. For COVID, of course, it's a different situation. We're talking about adults and children. And you could imagine, we hope we wouldn't need it, but you could imagine if we are going to mandate COVID vaccines because not enough people take them up, then the kind of sanctions might be to say, well, if you don't get vaccinated, we're not going to let you into nightclubs or crowded pubs or football stadia. In other words, we're going to protect the population from you because you're not a vaccinated person.
Tim Stanley?
Quick question. How would someone, say, a bouncer on a nightclub door, know that someone trying to get into the nightclub has not had the vaccination?
Well, there's a long history of vaccine certificates. And so the other really good example is yellow fever vaccination. We all love to travel, but there are many countries in Africa which will not let you in unless you have a yellow fever vaccination certificate.
But obviously, if I'm drunk and I'm going out to dance, I'm not going to walk around with my medical certificate to show that I can get into a nightclub. More importantly, the ethical dimension of this, and it applies in some respects to the lockdown measures as well. It sounds to me like you're proposing punishing someone, not for doing something wrong, but for not doing something good. And that's kind of unusual, isn't it?
Yes, I think that is unusual. Perhaps the equivalent would be the wearing a seatbelt.
Right.
Putting your seatbelt on is something good. It's actually something that there's a small overall, it saves lives. But if you're terribly unlucky, wearing a seatbelt in a car crash can cause a ruptured spleen, or it can cause a lung collapse. So it's quite a good parallel in the sense that overall it's beneficial to you. Overall, it's beneficial to society. There's a tiny risk, which is much smaller than the risk of not doing it.
Okay, thank you. No, I think that's a very good analogy. On the question of why it is people might be suspicious of vaccines in general, and as Anne said, we're not. I think I can speak for everyone on that. But you can understand, given the history of doctors and states making mistakes, that people are going to be suspicious, and therefore that you have to win them over.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think that people are suspicious in the sense that the medical profession has not always got it right. And I think, as you mentioned at the start, they've not always been quick enough to declare when things have not been right. And we do have to win people over. But that's why with this vaccine, we are putting it through all the normal regulatory processes so that it is having all the normal safety checks. And I know people are concerned about the speed with which this is happening. And so for my children, I drew this analogy, which I think is quite a good one. I asked them how long it normally takes for us to get everything organised for Christmas, and they said 2 months. And I said, well, imagine if we only had a week to do it. Could we get it done in a week? And of course we could, because we wouldn't be doing anything else. And it's the same with the vaccines. They've been produced quickly because the whole biomedical research community has stopped pretty well doing any research except COVID research. But it's still going through all the same hoops.
Professor Solomon, thanks very much for joining us this evening. Tim, we spent the second half of the programme talking about this country and people who might, for all sorts of reasons, not want the vaccine. And Professor Solomon, our third witness, although he said hopefully not, eventually came round to saying, well, yes, it should be compulsory, is wrong word. There should be penalties, there should be sanctions. The state should try to, as far as it could, enforce this.
Yeah, and I've been trying to think through this issue from a religious point of view. And on the one hand, there is this sense of personal compulsion to do the right thing for the good of the community. On the other hand, there are lots of people who feel that their body is given to them by God. It is theirs, it's part of their person. And even if they might be persuaded that it's the right thing to do to take a vaccine, it is their choice, that is their definition of autonomy. And they feel that particularly strongly when it comes to their children. Now, they may well be wrong, but my argument would be, and I think Professor Solomon would actually agree with me, my argument would be persuade them, but treat them as intelligent, rational people. Don't just impose something on them. And part of the problem with the last few months, with this whole treatment of the lockdown, is things have been imposed, things have not been explained reasonably and fairly. We have on occasion been given bad data, and all of this creates bad blood, which means that when you finally come to people and say, and now we'd like to inject this into you, it does not surprise me that a small but substantial number of people say, I don't trust you to do that.
And pinned down, Professor Solomon talked about children who didn't get that vaccinated as an idea of a penalty or sanction, not be allowed to go to state school, their parents shouldn't be able to draw benefits, adults shouldn't be allowed in nightclubs, football matches and so on. How does that strike you?
I think for me, Professor Solomon is over the line of how far I consider it okay to go. And it was interesting that question about the collective and the individual, of course, reared its head. Some of the things that perhaps others found a bit more suspect, like, could you have a certification, for instance, like a card that says that you've been vaccinated? I didn't find that to be too onerous. I think that would be quite a useful thing. I think once you start saying your child cannot go to school because you are anti-vax or because you have refused this vaccination, you're in a really counterproductive territory. In fact, what happens is you get more and more slightly oddball homeschooling, and then the whole cycle gets worse and worse. And to me, it's not just a practical question. That is when you overdo the heavy hand and you reap a bit of a blowback from that. Anti-vax is very, very strong in Germany at the moment, and I think there's partly a sort of over-messaging and insistence has not landed with a certain part of the population. You need to reach them. And in fairness, Professor Solomon also did acknowledge that.
Mona, the moral core of this is the rights and the advantage of the collective over the individual, isn't it?
Absolutely. But and what is it that we're seeing over the last few months? That actually, if your child showed symptoms of COVID, you can't send them to school. You have to isolate them. And that's good for the whole community. So I think there's something quite visceral about jabs, because we're actually seeing it very, very as an invasive issue. And I completely agree that it is about communication and information. But at the end of the day, If something is going to save the lives of individuals as well as society as a whole, with all the caveats, with all the drawbacks, I think that the state has to intervene at some point.
That's it for this week. From our panel, Mona Siddiqui, Anne McElvoy, Tim Stanley and Matthew Taylor with his changed mind. And from me, until the same time next week, goodbye.